Good afternoon, Mr. Garcia. Thank you for joining me today.
Good afternoon.
Okay, can you hear me clearly?
Yes, can you hear me clearly?
Yes, wonderful. So before we begin discussing today's observation, I want to take a moment to explain the purpose behind these classroom visits and coaching conversations. Is that okay?
Yes.
As a campus leader, one of my responsibilities is to support instructional growth across the school. And classroom observations are not meant to be gotcha moments or simply evaluations. They're an opportunity for us to reflect together on the teaching practices and the student engagement that you do in your classroom, as well as the instructional systems that help students succeed. So these observations allow me to better understand what supports teachers' needs, identify those strengths to celebrate, and to ensure we're providing high quality instruction for every student. So my goal is always to partner with teachers like yourself through coaching, resources, collaboration, and ongoing support throughout the school year. Mr. Garcia, your role as a fifth grade social studies teacher is incredibly important. You are helping students build critical thinking skills, historical understanding, and communication skills, right? That is also with the ability to connect to past events and the world around them, which is incredibly important. Beyond the academics, you also play a major role in creating a safe and supportive learning environment where students feel valued and encouraged to grow. So teaching is complex. We all know this, right? And it can, it requires planning, relationship building with our students and staff, classroom management, instructional decision making, all at the same time. Now, because of that, growth conversations like this are meant to support professional learning, not perfection. So again, I appreciate your willingness to reflect openly and engage in this process. So, again, I appreciate you taking the time today to meet with me. Before we begin again, I want to acknowledge the consistent effort you've been putting into your classroom this year. It's clear that you deeply care about your students and that their learning experience is impactful. So today's conversation is meant to collaborate and to be collaborative and to be a growth focus. My role is to partner with you, not to evaluate you in isolation, as I mentioned before. So we can reflect, problem solve, build on some strategies that will strengthen your practice over time. So as we talk, I'll ask some reflective questions, share what I've observed, and we'll co-create these next steps together. Does that sound okay?
Yes, I appreciate that. I've been wanting to, excuse me, I've been wanting more guidance on how to improve, so I'm glad we can talk through it.
Wonderful. So let's start with your reflection. When you think about the lesson that I saw, what felt successful to you?
I think the opening went well. Students were engaged when we talked about prior knowledge and they asked questions.
That's great to hear. What do you think contributed to that engagement during the opening?
I think it was more interactive and students already knew some of the content.
That's an important insight because students tend to engage more when they can connect, right, with one another and with the lesson to what they already know in this world, right? So, like, kind of like understanding the background knowledge. Now, thinking about the rest of the lesson, where do you feel things became a little bit more challenging?
That was during independent work. Some students didn't understand what to do, and others finished too quickly or got off task.
Mm-hmm. And so, why do you think the students needed at that moment that they may not have received?
They probably needed clearer directions and maybe different levels of work. I feel like I'm teaching to the middle, and it's not really working for everyone.
Hmm. Okay. Do you think
So,
you? Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
sorry. Yeah. So I also struggle with managing behavior while helping confused students. It feels like I can't do both effectively.
Okay, so I want to pause for a moment and highlight some of your strengths that I've observed. And thank you again for sharing those reflections on the challenges, because I think it's also important to build off the foundations of your strength, right? What I have noticed in the classroom is that you do really have strong relationships with your students. I see how they respond to you and how they feel comfortable in participating when you have your lessons, the way they raise their hands, the way they interact with you. It's a great space. It feels like a very safe space for your students. Also, your content knowledge is very clear and accurate. And that's really important because that builds, right, the credibility with your students because you're showing them your knowledge, what you know.
Mm.
And also, you made intentional efforts to connect to prior learning, as I mentioned before, that background knowledge, which is high impact instructional, right? That's a great move for you to do because you're pulling in that knowledge that they already know and then scaffolding, right, and building on that.
Mhm.
And you also circulated during the lesson. That means that you walked around, you looked for anybody who was off task, which showed awareness, right, and care for the students, making sure that they were progressing in what they were learning in the lesson. So let me ask you, what are these strengths that which are whoops, let me start again. Which of these strengths do you feel most confident about right now?
Right now, definitely relationships. And I try to make sure students feel comfortable.
Yes, and that shows, right? The strength is going to be such a major asset for you, right? When you're strengthening that instructional system in your classroom, right? Students already trust you, they already know you. Now we can build those structures that examine or maximize that learning time in your classroom. So let's dig into a few key areas where we can grow. I'm going to name what I observed, and then I want us to think about the why together. Can we do that?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, again, I want to connect to this feedback directly to specific evidence that I saw, right, from the observation so we can have a clear identify or to clearly identify what the students were experiencing. So from my notes, I wrote down that at approximately 10:15 this morning when we were reviewing the lesson, students transitioned from independent work, right? So within the first few minutes, I observed that several students were raising their hands for clarification, while others hadn't really started the assignment yet. So by 10:20, which is 5 minutes, a group of students had completed the assignment early and began a side conversation. I noticed that during the independent work, the engagement dropped from several students, right? Some were unsure what to do, while others finished early and disengaged. So, thinking about that, when you reflect on that moment, what do you think the students needed from the structure of the lesson that may have been missing?
Honestly, I don't have a consistent system. I try to give it, I try to give extra work, but it's not always ready.
Thank you. And that's a great thing that you brought up the systems in your classroom. That's something that I wanted to make sure you did emphasize on. Is there any more you'd like to expand on that?
Well, that's where I feel unprepared sometimes. And I know students need different things, but I don't always know how to plan for that. So sometimes I spend too much, excuse me, I spend so much time creating the lesson itself that I don't have enough time to think through what students will do if they struggle or finish early. Then during the lesson, I feel like I'm reacting instead of leading.
Okay, thank you for sharing that with me. I want to also clarify also some clarity for these directions, right? I want to discuss how I'm going to pause.
Okay.
So I also want to discuss clarity of directions using evidence that was collected in this observation. So at approximately 10:12, the directions for the assignment were provided verbally in about 30 seconds. And I noticed several students looking around at peers before beginning. Within the first 3 minutes, at least 5 or 6 students asked questions such as, "What are we writing?" and "Where do I put the answers?" I also noticed that the directions were primarily verbal, and several students needed clarification. So, how do you typically check for understanding after giving directions for a lesson?
I usually ask if there are any questions, but students don't always respond.
Yeah, that's very common. Students often say that they understand even though they don't. One coaching strategy that I've used is, and what could help with you, is that we use the student restate method. After directions are given, ask a student to explain the task in their own words. That gives them the immediate evidence of whether directions were truly understood
Mhm.
before students begin working independently. So, another challenge that I did see was that observed that the assignment had one level of rigor and support for all of the students. For example, I noticed some students completed the work in under 5 minutes, while other students had difficulty getting started without teacher assistance. That tells us students weren't entering the were that tells us that students were entering the task with different readiness levels. So
Mhm.
the task was the same for all students, which made it challenging to meet different learning needs. What has been your experience with differentiation so far?
Well, I find it overwhelming. Planning for one lesson already takes a lot of time. So
Mhm.
planning for multiple versions feels difficult. I would really benefit from examples or templates, and I'm not sure how to start. I think seeing what differentiation actually looks like in a real classroom would help me understand how to make it more manageable.
Thank you again, Mr. Garcia, for sharing that. That's something that I'm going to take note of, and I'm going to make sure that we talk about differentiation before the end of this conversation today. Okay?
Okay.
Another observation that I noticed in my notes was the transitions in classroom procedures. At the transition point between the whole group instruction and independent work, the shift took approximately about 3 minutes before all students were settled and working. During that time, multiple reminders were needed regarding voice levels and task expectations. During the transition from whole group to independent work, there is some loss of instructional time and increased noise. What routines do you currently teach for transitions?
I go over expectations, but I don't think I've practiced them enough with the students.
That's a key insight, right? Routines require explicit teaching and repetition, just like academic skills, right? So,
Mhm.
again, I appreciate your openness throughout this conversation, and that willingness to reflect honestly is an important quality in effective teachers and educators. Let's now shift into a problem-solving mode. I want us to identify practical, manageable steps that you can realistically implement without feeling overwhelmed. Again, we're not trying to fix everything at once. We're focusing on high impact changes that will improve student engagement and classroom structure immediately. Let's turn these challenges that we just discussed into some actionable next steps. I'll share some strategies and we'll decide what feels manageable to start with. And I'm going to share my screen with you, Mr. Garcia, if you can just be patient with me to do that.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to ask you if you can see my screen.
Yes, yes, I can.
Okay, great. So the first strategy I wanted to discuss with you is strengthening directions. Now, when we talked about the first challenge, right, we wanted to talk about making sure that students were understanding what you're explaining, right, before they go into independent work, their instructions to the lesson. So one thing that you can do rather than just do a verbal instruction is to post the written directions visually, right? So you can do that on the board, on your whiteboard, or you can do that on your smart board, right? You can have it on the screen in which they can look back and see the instructions on the board. You can also model the task step by step. Depending on what your lesson is, you can model what you expect from them. For example, if you're beginning and you're wanting the students to do a type of research project, think about what would be your first steps, right, to begin the research project. So we don't have to go fully into that, but taking the steps to begin the research project and showing them how to do that. That could initiate them into doing the independent work. Using turn and tell for students to restate the expectations, right? So when we ask turn and tell, we ask the students to turn to their neighbor and restate the instructions for the lesson. And that gives an opportunity for them to have peer-to-peer conversations, peer-to-peer understanding. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Wonderful. So let's take a look at, and I'm sorry this is not in full mode, but we can all see it, right? It's okay, it's
Mhm.
clear. Okay,
Yes.
great. So strategy two, again, we want to focus on, as I mentioned earlier, differentiation is very important in our class because we have students of all learning backgrounds, different levels of backgrounds of learning, and so we want to make sure that students are able to stay engaged in that, right? So we want to make sure that we create at least two levels of task instead of three. And that means that we want to make sure that we give an opportunity for you not to overwork yourself, right? You just want to give an opportunity to at least provide some advanced lessons, lessons within the lesson. That way, your students who are higher learning within the classroom understand and can be a little bit more engaged than a student that doesn't have as much understanding. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
And you can add one extension for those early finishers, right? We always have students that kind of go through it very quickly. You can have an extended activity for them that could require, any additional maybe research questions or prompts you want to add for them. Just for the example for today, right? When we're talking about the colonies, you could go into a deeper dive into the colonies, maybe in a specific period. Your students could develop, much more intense um, feedback for you based on what you're asking for them, right? So, yeah, just kind of building on those extensions and using small groups once per lesson instead of the all period. So, that means that you put the students into small groups for them to learn with one another. Instead of having them do whole group instructions or work, you can always pull them into small groups, but not doing that the entire lesson. You want them to also work independently, right? So, which of these do you think might be a little bit more doable this week?
I think starting with clearer directions and one extension activity would be manageable.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
Let's go to the next strategy, which is engagement structures, right? We want to use those partner check-ins during independent work. That's something that, again, goes to the peer-to-peer learning where you can have students check in with their partner in the class, in their small group, or in their table settings, wherever you have them seated, and have them check in on how they're doing together. You could also check in with them by bringing them to your table and asking them to tell you their status of where they're at in their independent work. Again, you are keeping them engaged, but you're also showing them how you are engaged in their learning and wanting to see how they're doing, right? You want to break that task into smaller chunks with checkpoints, which means that if you have a large project going on, you can always have checkpoints throughout the lesson, throughout the independent work, having them kind of check in with you. How's everybody? One time, in one of my classes, a very simple like thumbs up, man, I'm not doing too well, or yeah, I'm not getting this. Doing those quick little checkpoints with students gives you a better understanding of where everyone is at. If everybody's on this level, we're having a problem, right? We have to go back and kind of make sure we're all understanding the lesson. We want to be here. So, making sure you use timers to maintain the pacing. This is also really important when you're doing your assessments and when we're testing. We want students to pace themselves when they're doing their work, especially when they're independently working. We want them to look at the time and make sure that they are on task. We have a lot of times when we can daydream, right? Or we're not paying attention, but we want to make sure that our students are aware that there is a time and they need to be paced. And those are skills that you can obviously develop with them as the year goes forward. You can work with them on their pacing. Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am, it does.
All right. So let's check out the next strategy. So the next one is based on, just a moment, on the classroom management systems, right? We've touched base a little bit on this. If you can give me just a second with my There we go. So we want to practice our transitions explicitly, right? So that means that when we are doing our transitions, usually at the beginning of the year, we set our expectations with our students and then we model them, right? Throughout the first couple of weeks of our school year, we want to show them how we're supposed to follow the expectations and the rules in the classroom. And especially kind of reminding them once we get into the later part of the year, reminding them those expectations, making sure that they are aware. But we ourselves have to show that, right? We have to show them and practice those transitions, making sure that they understand the importance of that time because we want to have enough instructional time when they're in the classroom. So again, using those consistent signals, visual cues, like you can always use a card, depending on the color of the card, or you can have a countdown like 3, 2, 1. All right, let's get to work. You can always do those very simple, consistent signals that they will be aware of in your classroom that they know that they need to move into the next part of the class. Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am.
Great. And also reinforcing those expectations before release. That means before they leave for the day, before they leave to their next class period, you let them know, remind them with some positive cues of saying, like, you guys did a great job moving from this to this, wonderful. You can even highlight some students by saying, Adrian, you did amazing, or Isaac, you did great on this, or Miranda, wonderful on doing this and helping your partner. Those are great ways to show that positive feedback again in that engagement with your students. Does that sound good?
Yes,
Sound
ma'am.
like something you can do?
Yes, most definitely.
Wonderful. So the last thing I wanted to show, I wanted to review with you some of these differentiation skills that we talked about earlier.
Hmm.
And I have an incredible resource from YouTube. And it is from Education Week that I do want to share with you. And you can go off camera at this point to watch the film. Let's see if we don't have any tech issues. But I want you to just take some time to reflect on what's being said. And then afterwards, we're going to talk a little bit about it. Does that sound okay?
Yes.
Okay, let's see. Let's make sure this works. Can you hear?
I'm Larry Falaschi.
Okay, great. We're going to
Differentiating.
go off camera now.
To some educators, it conjures visions of having to create a different lesson for every student in the room and long nights of planning and grading. That insanity is not what differentiation is all about. Differentiating instruction is really a way of thinking, not a pre planned list of strategies. Oftentimes, it is making decisions in the moment based on this mindset. It's recognizing that, to paraphrase Rick Wormley, fair doesn't always mean treating everyone equally. It's recognizing that all of our students bring different gifts and challenges, and that as educators, we need to recognize those differences and use our professional judgment to flexibly respond to them in our teaching. Carol Tomlinson talks about the ability to differentiate in three areas: content, process, and product. For content, student choice is one way we might differentiate, like allowing students to choose their research topics or essay prompts. As teachers, we need to keep our eyes on the prize. In other words, we have to keep asking ourselves, what are the main learning objectives? One day, my students were writing an argument essay about what would be the worst natural disaster to experience. John's head was down on the desk. He was not doing anything. I knew that he was interested in football, so I told him that he could write an essay on why his favorite team was the best. He would still have to make an argument just about football instead of hurricanes or earthquakes. His eyes lit up. He got to work and wrote what his mother later told me was the first essay he had ever written in school. He had followed all the guidelines of a good argument essay. The prize, in this case, was learning to write an argument essay, not learning to write about natural disasters. To differentiate by process, teachers can change up how they group students. Sometimes a mixed ability group might work best, while sometimes it might be appropriate to have same ability groups. We might have an English proficient buddy work with an English language learner to help them out. During independent reading time in my early morning class several years ago, one student tended to fall asleep. I told him that if he wanted, he could go to the back and sit on a desk and read. Soon, several others joined him. A few days later, I saw another student dozing off.
Before I could say anything, one of his classmates whispered to him, "Just go sit on a desk." Again, it's a matter of keeping our eyes on the prize. What are the learning objectives and what are the best roads to get there for different students? Teachers can also differentiate by the type of product students create. The major demonstration of learning doesn't always have to be an essay or a multiple choice test. One year, I had a student who liked to doodle when other students or I were talking. I told her it was okay as long as she was doodling about the information we were discussing. She built on those doodles to create a final project that brilliantly and visually represented all the key points we had covered. When I give tests, I often give students an extra blank page where they can write anything else they remember about the topic being tested that they think is important. I often find the quality of thinking and writing better there than in response to my test questions. None of the differentiating strategies I've mentioned have created any extra work for me. They did require that I had relationships with my students to know their strengths, challenges, and interests. And I needed to demonstrate flexibility in my thinking. Making these strategies successful also required building a strong class culture so that some of the students were being treated differently and they understood why. And they understood that that was the only way to be truly fair. The ideas mentioned here are just a drop in the bucket. There are a zillion other ways we can support our students' gifts and challenges. We just need to keep our minds and ears open.
Okay, that was a wonderful video, wasn't that?
Yes, yes, it was.
Okay, I'm gonna have your video back on. Now, one other thing that I did want to share with you through Edutopia, and I think your phone might be on backwards, sir, but
Oh,
if
it is. I'm
that's
sorry.
okay. So,
How about now?
Edutopia is a great resource, Mr. Garcia, for you to use whenever you have any questions about the topics that we discuss, or if anything comes to mind about your teaching style, some strategies. This is such a great resource for educators. This is just a quick overview. It gives you great links to some reads, some planning and implementation ideas, understanding and knowing how to assess your students. There's just a great, diverse amount of information here for you to use, and even in technology. And also, one thing that I didn't show you on the YouTube video, YouTube also has what's called shorts. You probably heard of them of Reels on Instagram, right? So you
Mhm.
can go on YouTube and type in the topic that you're looking for. Like, for example, we talked about differentiation. Look it up, and you can find many videos that could give you a quick kind of review or understanding of what it means. Or maybe if you just need a little bit of a help with an idea, those are really great too. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment because I do want to ask you a few questions.
Okay.
Okay. Can you see my screen? Okay, we don't see my
Yes,
screen
I can see.
anymore. Wonderful. Okay, Mr. Garcia, again, this is not a quiz. This is just how you feel, just a reflection. I mean, in the video, the author, the narrator, I should say, mentioned that differentiation is not about creating a separate lesson for every student, right? So, how does that perspective influence your instructional planning?
That perspective reminds me to focus on flexibility within one lesson rather than trying to completely redesign instruction for each student. I plan with multiple entry points and support so all students can access the content.
Wonderful. That's a very great way of reflecting on that. He also mentioned using low lift strategies, right, for differentiation. Which low lift strategy could you use in your classroom?
Um, I could use sentence stems, flexible grouping, modeling, student choice, and scaffolded questions. These strategies are manageable to implement and help support a wide range of learners.
Very good. That's awesome. And according to the video, differentiation supports students with different gifts, right, and challenges. So how do you ensure that all learners feel supported in your classroom?
I can try to provide multiple ways for students to engage with content and demonstrate understanding. I also create an environment where students feel comfortable asking questions and taking academic risks.
Right, very good. One thing that did stand out to me in the video was when he talked about how an English language learner and a more advanced, English speaker could be put together to help one another. I thought that was such a great way to like show peer to peer, how to demonstrate understanding, how to show helping one another right in that area. That's a really great way to do that, especially when you have English language learners in your classroom, right? So again, how does this video challenge or reinforce your current understanding of the differentiated instruction?
The video reinforced that differentiation does not have to be overwhelming.
Hmm.
It reminded me that small intentional adjustments and strong relationships can have a significant impact on a student learning.
Hmm. So, again, what impact do you believe differentiated instruction has on student engagement and confidence?
Right. So when students feel supported and capable of success, they participate more actively and build confidence.
Hmm.
Differentiation helps students feel that learning is accessible to them.
That's so wonderful that you bring that up. And as I mentioned earlier, you have a great relationship with your students. They trust you. And I feel like that's something that you can build on, right? So, again, I'm here to support you as we move forward through this school year. What I'll be doing for the next couple of weeks is I'm going to be scheduling an observation of a colleague strong in differentiation, which means that you'll be going to their classroom to observe them in the way they differentiate during their lessons. Does that sound okay?
Yes, yes, it does.
Okay, and then I'm going to be providing you with some planning templates and some sampled tiered lessons so you can see how they compare to what you're working on, or maybe just build on what those lessons are, right? I'm going to connect you also with an instructional coach here on campus to have some weekly support, some weekly meetings, and maybe if there's any questions that you may have or anything that can support you with, they'll be able to do that. Also, we'll be conducting a follow-up walkthrough in 3 weeks with feedback. So, similar to what we did today, I'll be observing you and then providing the feedback. And I'm going to offer to co-plan a lesson with you if it's helpful. If you'd like for me to work with you on a lesson just so we can kind of, brainstorm it out and if any questions you may have, we can kind of work on that together. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, that would be really helpful. I think co-planning would make a big difference. I also feel like I would like, excuse me, I also feel like I'm behind on pacing, so I worry about trying new strategies while covering new content.
And that's a very real concern, right? And many teachers experience that challenge. What I want you to remember is that the strong systems and routines actually create more instructional time. So when students understand the expectations, the transitions, they become faster, directions become clearer, and you spend less time redirecting behavior, right? The goal is not perfection immediately. We know that's not perfect, that's not going to happen. And the goal is a steady progress with support along the way. So let's set a focused goal for the next few weeks. The goal will be to improve the clarity of directions and student engagement during independent work through structured routines and one differentiated strategy. Could we work on that goal?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Mr. Garcia, thank you. I want you to know that I truly see your commitment to students, the relationships you've built, the care you show, and your willingness to reflect honestly today are all indicators of a teacher who wants to grow and make an impact. Effective teaching is not about being perfect. It's about being reflective, consistent, and open to growth. The challenges we discussed today are common for all educators, especially when balancing instruction, classroom management, differentiation, and student engagement all at once. What's important is that you are willing to examine your practice as we did today and take steps forward. And that mindset is going to help you to continue developing into a very strong educator. I also want to emphasize that this process does not stop with today's meeting. I am committed to supporting you throughout the entire school year. You will not be expected to navigate these challenges alone. I will continue providing coaching, walkthrough feedback, instructional resources, opportunities to observe colleagues, and time collaboration. I believe in your ability to strengthen your instructional systems because the foundation is already there. Students trust you, they respond to you positively, and they benefit from the positive environment you've created. As we move forward, we'll continue celebrating progress while also identifying areas for continued growth. The goal is always to improve outcomes for students and the continued professional growth for you as an educator.
Thank you, Dr. Tovar. I
Mhm.
feel more supported and clear about what I need to focus on moving forward.
Wonderful. And that's exactly what I hoped for. I appreciate your professionalism, your openness, and your dedication to your students. And I'm looking forward to continuing this work together and supporting your growth throughout the year. Thank you again for joining me, Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Miss Dr. Tovar.
We'll talk very soon, okay?
Yes, ma'am. Looking
Wonderful.
forward to it. Bye bye.
Bye bye.